The night was heavy with the hum of engines and the metallic clatter of rotors slicing through the damp jungle air, a sound that should have promised salvation but instead carried the weight of captivity, for the men inside the chopper believed the woman bound to the steel seat in the rear cabin was helpless, broken, and entirely at their mercy, her wrists cuffed in front of her, ankles tied, head bowed as though she had accepted her fate, yet inside her mind the fire burned hotter than the engine turbines, each second sharpening her resolve, each insult thrown at her sharpening the blade of vengeance she intended to carve into their arrogance, because they had underestimated her from the beginning, mistaking silence for surrender, mistaking composure for weakness, and above all, mistaking her gender for incapacity, but she had waited, carefully watching the rhythm of the two guards seated across from her, one lazily cradling his rifle against his chest as though certain it would never be needed, the other leaning back with a smirk and a cigarette hanging from his lip, smoke curling like a taunt, as if daring her to twitch or struggle, unaware that beneath the shadow of her lowered face, her eyes were scanning every detail, the loose strap on the rifle sling, the flickering cockpit light that cast shadows over the pilots, the faint bulge of a sidearm in the holster of the one nearest her, and most importantly, the moment when the helicopter banked left and the men instinctively steadied themselves, loosening their posture just enough to create the opening she had been starving for, because she had trained herself long ago to see opportunities not in comfort but in chaos, and tonight, chaos was her ally. She flexed her wrists against the cuffs, feeling the edges bite into her skin, a pain she welcomed because it meant her plan could begin. She leaned forward as though to cough. The soldier with the cigarette chuckled and muttered something crude, glancing away for just a breath, but that was all she needed, snapping her knees upward with brutal precision, catching him in the chin so hard the cigarette flew from his mouth and the rifle clattered to the floor, and before the other man could react, she twisted her bound hands and brought the cuffs crashing down on his nose with a crunch that drowned in the roar of the rotors, blood spurting as he howled and lost grip of his weapon, which tumbled beside her boots, and with the speed of instinct. Sharpened by survival, she dropped her weight, grabbed the rifle awkwardly in her bound hands, spun the barrel upward, and drove the butt into the first guard's temple, silencing him instantly, then slammed the edge of the stock against the second man's jaw, his scream muffled as she drove her shoulder into his chest and pinned him against the bulkhead, her breaths sharp, heart pounding, not in fear but in the intoxicating rhythm of taking back control, and when the pilots shouted from the cockpit, demanding to know what was happening, she didn't answer because words were wasted when action was a sharper language. Instead she smashed the guard's head once more against the steel wall until he slumped unconscious, then crouched low, dragging her bound wrists across the fallen rifle's sling until the sharp edge of a broken buckle tore through the nylon strap that bound her ankles, freeing her legs, and with her knees unshackled she tore at the cuffs until the mechanism gave way. The bruises on her wrists already swelling but irrelevant compared to the surge of liberation that coursed through her veins, because for the first time in hours, maybe days, she was not their captive, she was the storm they had mistakenly brought into their sky, and she intended to hijack the very machine they thought would deliver her to her grave. She rose, steadying herself as the helicopter pitched against the night wind, rifle in her grip now solid and familiar, her eyes narrowing toward the cockpit where the two pilots exchanged frantic shouts, one reaching for the comms, the other jerking the controls to keep the bird steady, and in that instant she knew hesitation would mean death, because reinforcements could be summoned, coordinates transmitted, her rebellion strangled before it even bloomed, so she surged forward, slamming her boot against the cabin door, ripping it open with a fury that startled the pilots, their eyes widening in disbelief as they saw the prisoner standing there armed, alive and blazing with defiance. The co-pilot scrambled for his pistol but she was faster, raising the rifle and firing a controlled burst that shattered the comms panel into sparks, the cabin filling with smoke and panic, the pilot yelling in terror as the controls bucked, but she pressed the barrel against his temple and barked a single order: land now or die, her voice low but edged with iron, and though the machine fought the air, though the storm outside seemed determined to tear them all apart, the man at the stick obeyed, sweat pouring down his brow as he angled the chopper toward a clearing below, but she wasn't naive, she knew landing wasn't escape, it was only the next stage of the fight, because these men were part of something larger, a web of mercenaries and hunters who had thought they could break her, and to survive, to turn the tide, she would need more than courage, she would need to make this very helicopter her weapon, not her cage. And as the ground rushed up beneath them, jungle shadows opening into a clearing lit faintly by moonlight, she tightened her grip, mind racing with strategies, already calculating how to use the helicopter's guns, how to leverage the fear she now saw in the pilot's trembling hands, how to strip them of everything they had tried to use against her, and in that moment, drenched in sweat, bruises burning, yet eyes sharp and unbroken. She realized the truth that would carry her through every strike to come. They believed she was helpless, but now they would remember her as the woman who hijacked their chopper and turned their night into a war they never saw coming. The helicopter shuddered as it descended, skimming the treetops like a wounded beast fighting against gravity, its rotors whipping the humid jungle air into a frenzy, leaves and branches scattering in every direction as the skids touched down hard against the uneven clearing, the impact jarring through the frame. But she never let her rifle waver, the barrel still pressed to the pilot's temple as he struggled with the controls, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his voice cracking in desperate pleas that she ignored, for mercy was not in her vocabulary anymore, not after what they had done to her, not after the bruises, the interrogations, the long days of chains biting into her flesh. Every insult etched into her memory like fuel for a fire that could never again be extinguished, and as the rotors slowed just enough for the sound of the jungle to creep back into the night, the distant shrieks of howler monkeys, the hiss of insects swarming in the underbrush, she made her move, driving her elbow hard into the pilot's face, feeling the cartilage crunch beneath the strike, his body slumping sideways over the stick, and before the co-pilot could react she whipped the rifle butt into his jaw, sending him sprawling across the controls, sparks flaring from damaged panels as alarms screamed. But she yanked the two men out of their seats one by one, dragging them into the cabin with ruthless efficiency, slamming their heads against the steel frame until their resistance went limp, then cuffing their wrists with the very restraints that had once shackled her, leaving them sprawled unconscious in the rear cabin, roles reversed, prisoners of the woman they had thought to break. And for a moment she stood there, chest heaving, tasting the metallic tang of her own blood where her lip had split, her hair damp with sweat and sticking to her forehead, and she let herself savor it, the raw, undeniable shift in power, the knowledge that she was no longer running from death but steering it, no longer a passenger but the pilot of her own war, though the truth pressed against her just as sharply as the rifle grip in her hands. She had no idea how to actually fly the machine, not properly, not enough to navigate the vast jungle that stretched endlessly beneath the ghostly light of the moon, but that didn't matter yet because the helicopter itself was leverage, and leverage could buy time, and time was what she needed most, to think, to plan, to strike back. And as she scanned the instrument panels glowing in fractured light, she caught fragments of coordinates still glowing on a cracked display, a string of numbers that told her where they had been taking her, deeper into the jungle, toward some hidden fortress or camp where she would have been interrogated further, maybe executed, or worse, used as an example to others who dared defy their operation. And the thought churned her stomach with rage, because if they had such a camp, if they had such a stronghold, then there were others like her, prisoners trapped in cages, waiting for rescue that would never come unless she made it happen. And though exhaustion gnawed at her limbs, though her bruised wrists throbbed with pain, her spirit burned brighter than ever, and she made her decision with a clarity that cut through the night like lightning. She wouldn't just escape, she would strike them where it hurt most, use this very helicopter as her weapon, infiltrate their camp, free whoever they had chained, and make them taste the terror they had tried to feed her, because only then would her fight mean something more than survival, it would mean war, and war was the only language these men understood. But before she could even begin to act on that plan, the jungle reminded her that nothing came without consequence, for headlights pierced the treeline at the edge of the clearing, engines growled, and voices barked orders in the guttural accents of mercenaries rushing toward the noise. Drawn by the crash landing, their silhouettes multiplying as armed men poured into the clearing, rifles raised, flashlights cutting beams across the swirling dust and leaves, and she ducked instinctively behind the cockpit frame, cursing under her breath because she hadn't expected them to be so fast, hadn't accounted for the patrols likely scattered throughout the jungle. But fear didn't paralyze her, it sharpened her mind, forced her to act, and she scrambled across the controls, searching with frantic precision until her hand found the mounted minigun control panel, a toggle switch still intact despite the damage, and without hesitation she yanked it down, the gun beneath the chopper roaring to life with a metallic scream, barrels spinning into a storm of fire and lead that ripped across the clearing, cutting through the mercenaries like paper, their shouts drowned by the furious thunder, bodies scattering, vehicles exploding into flames as bullets chewed through fuel tanks, the night erupting into chaos so sudden it felt unreal, like a nightmare painted in fire. But she didn't stop, not until the last of the headlights shattered, not until the jungle fell silent again except for the crackle of flames and the fading echo of gunfire, and when the gun finally spun down, smoking and reeking of cordite, she sat there trembling, not with fear but with the adrenaline surge that left her fingertips tingling and her chest tight, her own power startling even her, the Realization settling heavy in her bones that she had just unleashed devastation with a weapon meant to keep her in chains, and though a part of her recoiled at the carnage, another part whispered the truth she could no longer deny, that hesitation was death, and if she wanted to dismantle the empire these men served, she would need to become the storm they could never predict, merciless when it mattered, ruthless when cornered, because mercy had been buried back in the cell they'd chained her in. And there was no digging it up again, not here, not now. She rose from the seat, stepping into the cabin, checking the unconscious men she had restrained, their shallow breaths proof they weren't dead yet, and she thought briefly of finishing them, of ensuring they could never rise to hunt her again, but she let them live, not from mercy but from strategy, because fear spread faster when survivors carried the tale, and she wanted her legend to burn through their ranks like wildfire, wanted every soldier in their network to know that the prisoner they had once called helpless was now the ghost in their jungle, the hijacker of their machines, the executioner of their brothers, and she would not stop until she tore their empire to the ground piece by piece, leaving only smoke and silence where their arrogance once stood, and with that vow seared into her veins, she gripped the rifle tighter, adjusted the stolen sidearm at her hip, and stepped out into the night, the jungle air hot and suffocating, the flames of burning vehicles painting the clearing in blood-red light, and for the first time in what felt like years she smiled, not out of joy but out of defiance, because this was only the beginning, and the war she was about to unleash would be written not in whispers, but in fire. The jungle swallowed her as she left the smoldering clearing behind, the glow of burning trucks and the dying echo of gunfire fading into the oppressive weight of darkness, but she moved with purpose, every step measured, every breath steady, her body battered but her mind sharp, guided by instinct and a burning conviction that grew stronger with each stride, for she was no longer the hunted but the hunter, and though the mercenaries would regroup, though they would descend on this place with reinforcements once dawn cracked the horizon, she had already taken the advantage. She had their machine, their weapons, and most importantly their fear, which would spread faster than any bullet. Yet she knew better than to linger on victory because triumph in one skirmish meant nothing in a war this vast, and she could almost feel the jungle whispering around her, alive with unseen predators, its wet soil sucking at her boots, vines clutching at her arms like skeletal fingers, mosquitoes whining in relentless swarms, but she pushed through it, each sting of her skin a reminder she was alive, that she had endured worse than this, and as she moved deeper into the shadows her mind replayed the coordinates she had seen glowing on the cracked cockpit screen, numbers etched into her memory like a map to destiny, leading her toward the camp they had been taking her to, the stronghold where their power pulsed like a diseased heart in the center of this wilderness, and she intended to cut it out, not recklessly, not by storming and guns blazing but with precision, strategy, the way they would never expect from someone they once dismissed as helpless, so she navigated by the moonlight breaking through the canopy, her boots silent against the damp earth, her rifle slung across her back while her hands traced the map in her mind, calculating distance, direction, and the time it would take before the mercenaries noticed what she was doing, and she realized she had maybe hours, perhaps less, before their radios carried word of her uprising, before their helicopters swept the skies searching for her trail, so she pressed harder, faster, ignoring the ache in her ribs, the dull throb in her wrists, where the cuffs had bitten, until the distant sound of rushing water reached her ears, a river, wide and unforgiving, carving its path through the jungle, and as she pushed through the last of the thick brush and saw it, silver under the moon, frothing against jagged rocks, she felt a flicker of relief, because rivers were lifelines, they could lead to settlements, supply routes, or in her case, serve as a natural guide straight toward the enemy's camp, since she remembered clearly from the fragments of intel she had overheard during her captivity that their fortress had been built near water, both for transport and for control, because men like them always bent nature to their will, carving docks and supply chains where no one else dared, and she crouched low by the bank, filling her lungs with the damp, earthy air as she studied the current, knowing the river was both ally and danger, fast enough to carry her but merciless to the unprepared, yet hesitation had no place in her world anymore, so she tied the rifle securely across her chest, checked the pistol at her hip, and without a second thought, plunged into the icy torrent, the shock biting into her muscles, dragging her under with ruthless force, but she kicked hard, angling her body, letting the current carry her while she fought to stay above water, her lungs burning, her eyes stinging, but her determination cutting through it all, and as the river hurled her downstream, slamming her against rocks, spinning her like prey in the jaws of a beast, she refused to let go, clinging to the one truth that had carried her this far. Pain was temporary, survival was permanent, and when at last the river spat her out into calmer waters, tossing her against a sandbank where reeds swayed like silent witnesses, She dragged herself ashore, coughing, shivering, her body shaking with exhaustion, but her grip on the rifle never loosened, her spirit never faltered, and as she lay there on the sand, staring up at the canopy of stars shimmering through the break in the trees, she whispered to herself the vow that had become her lifeline: I will not break, I will not stop, and they will never own me again. Then she forced herself upright, every muscle protesting, but her will stronger than flesh, and she pressed on into the jungle once more, guided now by the faint glow of torchlight flickering in the distance, a glow that set her pulse racing, because it meant she was close, closer than she had dared hope. The coordinates now coming alive before her eyes as the sound of voices drifted on the wind, rough and careless, the chatter of guards who believed the night was theirs, their laughter cutting through the insect hum, and as she crept closer, crawling through the underbrush, she saw them. 2 mercenaries standing by a crude outpost at the edge of a fence, their rifles slung loose, cigarettes glowing in their fingers, their posture lazy in the false comfort of routine, and rage surged in her chest at the sight of them, not because of who they were but because of what they represented: arrogance, complacency, the same blind underestimation that had almost cost her everything, and she swore she would carve that arrogance out of them one by one, but she also knew that rushing them head-on would be suicide, that patience would turn the tide more than fury, so she slowed her breathing, studied their movements, noted the rhythm of their glances, the distance between them, the blind spots left open when one turned to flick ash, and she crawled closer, inch by inch, her heartbeat sinking with the rustle of the jungle until she was near enough to smell the acrid smoke of their cigarettes, near enough to hear one murmur something about the prisoner arriving by dawn, words that confirmed everything she needed to know. This was the place, the camp, the fortress that had waited for her, but instead of being delivered here in chains, she had come as a ghost in the night, unseen, unstoppable, and she smiled in the shadows, a grim, feral smile, because they believed she was still on her way, helpless in the back of a helicopter that was now burning in the clearing behind her, and they had no idea that she was already here, watching, planning, ready to turn their night into fire. The guards at the outpost were still laughing, their voices drifting lazily into the night, their rifles hanging loose as if the jungle itself had been tamed by their arrogance, and she stayed low. In the brush, every muscle coiled, her breath slow, her eyes narrowed as she studied their rhythm, the way one turned his back every time he exhaled smoke, the way the other leaned on his rifle as though it were a walking stick, leaving the gate between them unguarded for precious seconds, and she knew opportunity when she saw it. She had survived this long by turning fractions of time into lifelines, so she slid silently forward, the soil damp beneath her belly, the reeds masking her silhouette as she crept close enough to hear their boots scuff against the earth, and then she struck, bursting from the undergrowth like a shadow-given form, her hand clamping over the mouth of the first guard before he could cry out, her knife flashing in a swift arc that slit his throat so cleanly the cigarette tumbled from his lips before the blood followed, and she caught his collapsing body with ruthless precision, lowering him silently to the ground, his death swallowed by the night as she spun toward the second guard, who had only begun to widen his eyes in horror, too stunned to raise his rifle before her boot drove into his knee, snapping it backward with a sickening crack, his scream cut short as she slammed the hilt of her knife into his temple, the impact dropping him like a sack of grain, unconscious but alive, and she considered finishing him, but again she chose restraint, not out of pity but out of strategy, because survivors told stories and she wanted this camp to tremble at the tail of the phantom who carved her way in, leaving bodies where no alarms had sounded, fear spreading through their ranks faster than bullets ever could, and with the 2 guards neutralized she dragged the unconscious one into the brush, propping him against the roots of a sprawling tree, his broken leg twisted grotesquely beneath him, while the dead one she left sprawled by the gate, his lifeless eyes staring up at the indifferent stars, a silent omen for the rest of the mercenaries. And then she turned her focus to the fence itself, a crude construction of corrugated steel sheets and barbed wire, patched together in haste but sturdy enough to keep prisoners in and the curious out, and she crouched near the gate, examining the padlock that sealed it, thick and rusted but solid, too loud to break without drawing attention. But she had learned long ago that barriers were never perfect, and after a slow, patient search along the fence line she found what she was looking for, a section where the ground dipped, where the steel sagged from neglect, the barbed wire drooping low enough for someone determined to slip beneath it, and determination was something she had in abundance, so she flattened herself against the earth and crawled under, ignoring the sting of the wire scraping her back, ignoring the mud that smeared her arms, until she was inside, crouched low among crates stacked haphazardly along the perimeter, the camp sprawling before her like a hidden city, lit by torches and floodlights powered by humming generators. Wooden barracks and steel huts rising from the jungle floor, walkways crisscrossing between them, and guards patrolling in lazy circles, their discipline eroded by overconfidence, and she moved like smoke among them, keeping to the shadows, every step silent, her eyes scanning constantly for weaknesses, for patterns, and then she saw them. The cages, lined up in a row near the center of the camp, crude metal prisons filled with human silhouettes, huddled figures barely illuminated by the flickering lights, their postures slumped, their faces gaunt, but their existence enough to ignite a deeper fire in her chest, because she had been right, she wasn't the only one they had taken, there were others, dozens perhaps, all trapped, waiting for rescue that would never come if she failed, and in that moment, her mission sharpened from survival to vengeance, from escape to liberation, because it was no longer just about her, it was about tearing this entire machine apart and freeing every soul it had crushed, but clarity was not safety, and she knew rushing the cages now would mean death. The guards would sound the alarm, bullets would cut her down before she touched a lock, so she forced herself to wait, to watch, to plan, her breathing steady even as her heart screamed to act, and she noticed the patterns, guards rotated every half hour, the floodlights sweeping in wide arcs that left blind spots, the cages locked with crude chains rather than high-tech systems, sloppy. For an organization that prided itself on power, and she realized their arrogance had left them vulnerable, blind to the possibility that anyone could come for these people, and she intended to exploit that blindness, but first she needed chaos, something to tear their attention away, to split their forces, and her gaze drifted toward the fuel depot near the edge of the camp, where barrels of gasoline and diesel sat stacked beside a pair of trucks, guarded lightly, a target so tempting it almost begged her to strike, and she knew then that fire would be her ally again, just as it had been in the clearing, fire to draw them scrambling, fire to give her the seconds she needed to break the cages open, fire to remind them that their control was nothing but smoke when confronted with her will, so she moved silently toward the depot, slipping between shadows, ducking behind crates, her knife in one hand, her pistol ready in the other, and when a lone guard appeared from behind a hut, his rifle slung casually as he adjusted his radio, she was on him before he could blink, her blade plunging into his chest, muffling his gasp as she dragged him behind the barrels, his blood spilling across the dirt, and then she went to work, unscrewing fuel caps, dousing the ground, splashing liquid across crates and tires, her movements quick but deliberate, her plan unfolding in her mind with crystalline clarity, and when the air was thick with the stench of gasoline, she struck a match. From the small waterproof kit she had taken off one of the fallen mercenaries, watching the flame flare to life in the darkness, and for a brief second she held it before her face, the fire reflected in her eyes, a reminder that destruction and liberation often walked hand in hand. Then she dropped it, and the world erupted, fire racing across the depot with a hungry roar, barrels exploding one after another, the night splitting open in a storm of light and sound, alarms screaming, mercenaries shouting in panic, their formations collapsing as they sprinted toward the inferno, rifles raised but useless against the flames that devoured their supplies, and in the chaos she slipped away, a shadow moving against the blaze, her knife cutting through the first chain at the cages, her hands working fast, her strength fueled by the cries of the prisoners inside, their voices rising in disbelief as freedom crashed upon them like a tidal wave, and she whispered urgently for silence, for patience as she tore through lock after lock, the fire behind her consuming the depot, the camp spiraling into madness, and she knew this was only the beginning, the first fracture in their empire, and she would not stop until the whole thing burned to ash. The prisoners blinked at her in stunned disbelief as the chains fell away, their gaunt faces lit by the firestorm raging behind her, the depot exploding in rolling waves that painted the night sky orange, and she barked at them in a low, fierce whisper to move, to keep silent, to follow her if they wanted to live, because there would be no second chance, no mercy if the mercenaries regrouped, and though their limbs trembled with weakness from starvation and captivity, something in her eyes, in her voice, ignited a spark in them, a spark that reminded them they were not corpses yet, that they still had breath and strength enough to run, and one by one they staggered out of their cages, clutching at each other for support, some limping, some barely standing, but all moving because she willed them to, because her defiance gave them a taste of their own long-buried defiance, and she led them into the shadows, weaving them between huts and crates as mercenaries thundered past, shouting orders, their attention swallowed by the inferno, their rifles firing at shadows in the flames as though bullets could kill fire, and she guided her group to the far side of the camp where the fence sagged low, the same gap she had slipped through, forcing them one by one beneath the wire, whispering urgent encouragement as they crawled on bleeding elbows and knees, until at last the last prisoner tumbled out into the jungle night, their breaths ragged, their eyes wide, their freedom still fragile, and only then did she allow herself a moment to breathe, crouching with them in the brush as the firelight flickered against their faces, but she knew it wasn't enough. Escaping the camp was one thing, surviving the mercenaries' wrath was another, because dawn would bring reinforcements, helicopters sweeping the skies, patrols scouring every trail, and this group of broken, starved survivors would not last a day without weapons, without direction, without someone to weld them into more than prey. And as she looked at them, men and women of different ages, some too young to have seen such horror, others hardened by years of captivity, she realized she could not abandon them, not to the jungle, not to the mercenaries, because their survival was now bound to hers, and their fight was hers as well. So she rose to her feet, blood still drying on her hands, and spoke in a voice that cut through their fear like a blade, telling them that the world believed they were lost, that the men in that camp believed they were broken. But tonight they had a choice: to keep running until the mercenaries hunted them down one by one, or to turn and fight, to carve a path out of this jungle with their own hands. And though some flinched at the word fight, though despair still clung to them like chains, others lifted their heads, eyes glimmering with the first light of something fierce. And she seized that spark, telling them they didn't need to be soldiers, that they didn't need training, only courage and unity, that the mercenaries bled like anyone else, burned like anyone else, and the fire behind them was proof that their empire was not invincible. And slowly, one by one, the prisoners nodded, murmuring their agreement, not loud, not triumphant, but steady, like a heartbeat beginning to pound again after being flatlined. And she felt it, hope, fragile but real, rising among them. And with hope came resolve, and with resolve came war. And she wasted no time, dividing them into pairs, sending the stronger to scavenge weapons from the dead guards near the cages, from the chaos in the camp, while the rest gathered makeshift tools from the jungle, branches sharpened into spears, rocks fashioned into crude clubs, because anything in their hands was better than empty fists. And soon they returned, trembling but armed, carrying rifles, pistols, knives, their fingers clumsy but eager. And she trained them quickly, efficiently, showing them how to load, how to aim, how to fire, her voice steady as she drilled commands into them, not with the softness of a savior but with the steel of a leader who knew hesitation would kill them all. And as she watched them steady their hands, straighten their backs, she felt something awaken inside her, something that had slept beneath the weight of her own survival, a sense of purpose larger than herself, the realization that she wasn't just escaping, she was raising an army, however small, however broken, and that army would be the ember that burned this jungle empire to the ground. But their first test came sooner than expected, for the mercenaries had discovered the cages, had found the bodies she had left in her wake, and now their shouts echoed through the camp, louder, angrier, laced with fury as they realized their prisoners were gone. And floodlights began to sweep outward, cutting through the trees. Engines roared to life as trucks mounted with guns tore across the clearing, and she knew their window was closing. So she moved fast, leading her ragtag group deeper into the jungle, weaving them through thickets and across shallow streams, her senses tuned to every sound, her ears straining against the rising roar of pursuit, until she found what she needed: a ridge overlooking the narrow road leading out of the camp, a choke point she could use, where the jungle funneled into a bottleneck and the trucks would have no choice but to slow. And she turned to her group, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt, their eyes wide but burning with determination now, and she laid out the plan in sharp, clipped words. They would ambush the convoy not for escape but for weapons, for supplies, for vehicles they could use to push deeper into the jungle and strike harder, because running would only delay death, but striking would carve a path toward victory. And they nodded, gripping their rifles tighter, their fears swallowed by something fiercer, and they took their positions along the ridge, crouched low among the rocks and foliage, waiting, the night thick with anticipation, until the first truck appeared, headlights cutting like knives through the dark, engines growling, mercenaries shouting as they leaned from the windows, rifles ready, expecting prey but not expecting war. And she raised her hand, holding it steady, the silence thick enough to crush lungs. And when the second truck rolled into the choke point, she dropped her hand, and the ridge exploded in fire, rifles cracking, bullets slicing through the night, mercenaries toppling from their seats, shouts turning to screams as chaos erupted, grenades rolling down into the narrow road, detonating in flashes that flipped one of the trucks onto its side, flames licking at the sky as the prisoners turned fighters screamed their rage, their desperation sharpened into violence. And she moved among them like a phantom, her rifle barking with precision, every shot a lesson in vengeance, every fallen mercenary a reminder that fear no longer ruled them. And though the mercenaries fired back, though bullets hissed past her head and tore into the ridge, the fight was theirs, because these were not prisoners anymore, these were survivors reborn in fire, and by the time the last mercenary fell, the road was littered with bodies and burning metal, and she stood among her fighters, chest heaving, her eyes scanning the wreckage, and she told them this was proof that they were no longer prey, that they could bleed the Empire dry, that this night was the beginning of something greater than escape, and the survivors roared their agreement, their voices echoing into the jungle, fierce and unbroken. And for the first time in her life she did not feel alone, she felt the weight of a rebellion rising at her back, and she knew that the men who had once believed she was helpless had only just begun to learn the truth of what she had become. The jungle echoed with the aftermath of their ambush, smoke curling upward from the burning trucks, the metallic scent of blood mingling with the acrid stench of diesel, and she stood at the center of it, her eyes sharp, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of battle. But there was no victory in her expression, only calculation, because she knew this was just the beginning, that every mercenary who had fallen tonight would soon be replaced by 10 more, that the empire she had struck would not retreat but come down upon them with fury, and she had to be ready, had to turn this ragtag band of starved survivors into something resembling an army before the jungle swallowed them whole. So she wasted no time, ordering them to strip weapons and ammunition from the dead, to scavenge food, radios, fuel, anything they could use, and though some flinched at the grisly work, others moved with grim determination, their fear tempered by the fire of what they had just accomplished, and soon they were armed better than before, their pockets heavy with magazines, grenades strapped to belts, rifles clutched in hands that only hours ago had been chained, and she looked at them, at their trembling but determined faces, and she knew she had to give them more than orders, she had to give them purpose, so she spoke again, her voice rising over the crackle of flames, telling them that this jungle was not their prison but their weapon, that the mercenaries would hunt them but the jungle would shield them if they learned to move like shadows, strike like predators, vanish like smoke, and she swore to teach them, to turn every weakness into strength. And as dawn broke, bleeding red light through the canopy, they buried their dead quickly and marched deeper into the wilderness, away from the road, away from the smell of ash, the jungle swallowing them with its thick green embrace. And the days that followed were merciless, a crucible that burned away the weak and left only the hardened, for the jungle gave nothing freely, its rivers treacherous, its nights alive with predators. But she drove them forward, teaching them how to move silently through underbrush, how to set traps with sharpened stakes and vines, how to mask their tracks and leave no trace. And when the mercenaries' patrols came, when helicopters thundered overhead and searchlights swept the canopy, they did not cower, they hid like ghosts, waiting until the perfect moment to strike, ambushing small squads, seizing more weapons, melting back into the foliage before reinforcements could arrive. And with each strike their confidence grew, their hunger for survival turning into hunger for vengeance, and she watched it with careful eyes, knowing rage could sharpen but also blind, so she tempered them with discipline, reminding them that this was not about slaughter but survival, not about revenge alone but freedom. And slowly they began to listen, began to trust her not just as the woman who had freed them but as their leader, their commander, the one who gave them a chance at life when death seemed certain. And as the rebellion took shape in the shadows, the mercenaries above grew restless, their patrols thicker, their traps more desperate, their voices sharper with fear as rumors spread of the ghost leading escaped prisoners through the jungle, a ghost who hijacked their machines, burned their camps, and slaughtered their brothers. And she smiled grimly when she overheard such whispers carried on the stolen radios, because fear was a weapon as sharp as any blade, and she wielded it without mercy, planting false trails, leaving bodies displayed like warnings, turning the jungle itself into a psychological battlefield. And soon the mercenaries were no longer the hunters but the hunted, jumping at shadows, firing into trees, exhausting themselves in paranoia while her fighters grew bolder, striking convoys, cutting supply lines, ambushing patrols, each victory feeding the next. And yet she knew it was not enough, not yet, because to truly cripple the empire she had to strike at its heart, the fortress. She had glimpsed in those coordinates, the stronghold where their leader sat in safety, orchestrating the chains and cages that had enslaved so many, and her every move now bent toward that end, gathering strength, training her fighters, forging them into a force that could storm the unstormable. And the jungle itself seemed to bow to her resolve, the rain washing away their tracks, the thunder masking their movements, the rivers carrying them unseen, until the day came when they stumbled upon a village deep within the forest, a scattering of huts on stilts by the riverbank, its people wary but not hostile, their eyes haunted with the same fear she had seen in the cages, for they too had lived under the shadow of the mercenaries, forced to pay tribute in food and labor, punished if they resisted. And when they saw her ragtag band of armed survivors, they did not call for help, they offered silence. And when they learned she had freed prisoners and burned a camp, their silence turned to cautious alliance, the elders giving them food, shelter, even guides who knew the rivers and trails better than anyone, and with each alliance, each small victory, her army grew, no longer just prisoners but villagers, hunters, families who had suffered too long, all drawn to the fire of her defiance, all willing to fight. And she stood before them one night, the firelight flickering across her face as she told them that the mercenaries' empire was nothing but fear and greed, and fear could be broken, greed could be starved, but only if they stood together. And when the villagers raised their voices in agreement, when they put their crude spears beside stolen rifles, she felt the tide shift, felt the rebellion swell beyond herself, and she knew the mercenaries had made their gravest mistake, not chaining her, not underestimating her, but giving her the chance to show others they could fight. And as her army trained beneath the canopy, as their traps claimed more patrols, as their raids cut deeper into supply lines, the Empire trembled, their commanders shouting into radios, their helicopters circling wider, their convoys traveling heavier, and she watched it all unfold with cold determination, knowing the final battle loomed, that the fortress still awaited, and when it fell, the world would remember not the prisoners who were broken, but the rebellion that rose from chains and turned the jungle into a graveyard for mercenaries. The rebellion had grown from a handful of gaunt survivors into a force that breathed like one body, a pulse in the jungle that the mercenaries could no longer ignore, and yet she knew numbers alone would not be enough, because the fortress that loomed at the heart of this empire was no crude camp or flimsy outpost. It was a citadel carved into the earth, built with steel and concrete, protected by fences, towers, floodlights, armored vehicles, and men who had spent years believing themselves untouchable. And to bring it down she needed more than courage, she needed a plan sharp enough to carve through their arrogance and fire strong enough to ignite their downfall. So she studied every scrap of intel scavenged from raids, every stolen map, every whispered rumor from villagers who had glimpsed its walls while being dragged there in chains, piecing together a picture of its defenses until it lived in her mind as clearly as the lines of her own palm. And when she gathered her fighters one night beneath the canopy, their faces lit by the glow of torches, their weapons glinting in the firelight, she laid out the plan with the precision of a blade, telling them they would not storm the fortress like fools, they would bleed it first, cut its veins before striking its heart, because even giants collapse when their foundations rot. And she detailed how their teams would move in waves, one to sabotage the fuel lines that fed the vehicles, one to cut the communications relays, one to ignite chaos at the gates while she led the strike team inside to find the command center and tear it down from within. And as she spoke, she saw the fire in their eyes, saw the fear swallowed by determination, for they had learned to trust her not as a savior but as one of them, forged in the same chains, hardened in the same crucible. And when she finished, there was no roar of voices, no dramatic declaration, only a silent nod from every fighter, a vow written in their stares that they would follow her into the mouth of hell itself. And she accepted that vow not with pride but with the weight of responsibility, knowing that every life that would fall was on her hands, and yet she carried it because no one else could, because she had been chosen by survival itself. And as dawn crept across the jungle, painting the mist in gold, they moved, silent as shadows, their feet brushing damp soil, their rifles cradled against their chests, the jungle hiding them like an ally as they closed in on the stronghold. And when at last the fortress loomed before them, its towers stabbing upward like jagged teeth, its floodlights sweeping in arcs across the clearing, they crouched in the treeline, hearts pounding in unison, and she scanned the defenses, every detail burning into her mind, until she raised her hand and gave the signal, and the rebellion split like a river into branches, each team peeling off into the foliage, vanishing into the undergrowth to carry out their tasks, while she remained with her strike team, a dozen of the strongest fighters who had bled beside her in ambushes and raids, their faces set in grim focus, their fingers steady on triggers, and together they waited, crouched in silence as the minutes dragged like hours, until the first explosion shattered the dawn, a fireball erupting at the edge of the compound where fuel trucks had been ignited, smoke billowing skyward in black plumes, alarms wailing as mercenaries scrambled in confusion, their shouts overlapping as they rushed toward the flames. And then came the second strike, the comms relay crackling with sparks as it went dark, cutting their radios into silence, leaving their commanders shouting orders that no one could hear, and chaos spread like wildfire, guards abandoning towers, vehicles roaring to life only to choke on fuel shortages. And she knew the moment had come, so she rose from the treeline with her rifle raised and her fighters at her back, and they surged across the clearing like shadows turned flesh, cutting down the first line of guards with silent precision. Blades slitting throats, suppressed fire spitting death before alarms could catch their movements, and they slipped through the chaos, weaving through smoke and shouts, until they breached the gates themselves, slipping inside the fortress that had been meant to swallow her whole, and the air was thick with gunpowder and panic, mercenaries sprinting in all directions, some trying to form ranks, others firing wildly into the smoke, and she moved among them like a phantom, her rifle cracking with deadly precision, her knife flashing when the rifle clicked empty, every strike purposeful, every kill a step closer to the command center, and her fighters followed with grim resolve, their voices silent, their fury unleashed only in the staccato bursts of gunfire and the clash of steel, and as they cut deeper into the fortress, the resistance grew fiercer, mercenaries rallying, their numbers swelling, bullets hissing through the air, grenades exploding against walls, concrete splintering and, for a moment the tide threatened to turn, the rebels pinned behind crates and shattered vehicles. But she refused to yield, she rose in the face of the storm, sprinted through the gunfire, vaulted over cover with a roar that split the chaos, and hurled a grenade into the heart of their formation, the explosion tearing through their ranks, the shockwave breaking their momentum, and her fighters surged forward again, rallying behind her, pushing through corridors of steel and smoke until the command center loomed before them, a bunker-like structure at the heart of the compound, its reinforced doors sealed, its walls bristling with guns, and she knew this was the final barrier, the place where the Empire's spine would snap if she broke through, and without hesitation she ordered her fighters to cover the perimeter while she sprinted forward with two of the strongest at her side, dragging satchels of explosives stolen from supply raids, planting them against the steel doors there. Hands moving with practiced precision as bullets pinged against the walls around them, and when the charges were set, she dragged her fighters back, ducked behind a concrete barricade and pressed the detonator, the explosion ripping through the fortress like thunder, fire blasting outward as the doors blew apart, steel torn from its hinges, smoke and dust choking the air, and she surged through the breach with her rifle raised, stepping into the command center as mercenaries staggered in shock. Their leader at the far end of the room, a man with cold eyes and a sneer of disbelief that twisted into rage as he saw her, the prisoner he had thought broken now standing in his sanctum, rifle aimed at his chest, and in that moment the noise of battle seemed to fade, the world narrowing to just the two of them, predator and prey, master and ghost, and she knew the war would not end with his death alone, but his fall would be the symbol that tore the rest of this empire apart, so she steadied her aim, her finger tightening on the trigger, ready to end the man who had once believed she was helpless, ready to carve his empire into ash with a single pull. The leader's sneer twisted into a mask of fury as he lunged toward the console, his hand slamming against a hidden alarm switch that sent a wail echoing through the bunker, but she had already anticipated desperation, her finger tightening on the trigger as she unleashed a burst that shattered the control panel into sparks, cutting the power, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the flicker of burning wires, and as the mercenaries inside scrambled, disoriented by the sudden loss of light, she moved with the precision of a predator, her rifle barking, each shot striking true, each enemy collapsing before they could raise their weapons, until only the leader remained, ducking behind a steel desk, firing blindly toward her with a pistol, his voice a mixture of rage and disbelief, shouting that she could not destroy what he had built, that his empire stretched beyond these walls, that she was nothing but a ghost who would vanish with the dawn. But she advanced steadily, her boots crunching on broken glass and smoldering wires, her eyes locked on the shadows where he hid, her breath steady even as bullets screamed past, because she had not come this far to falter. She had not carved a rebellion from chains and blood to be dismissed as nothing, and when his pistol clicked empty, when his curses turned to silence, she rounded the desk and found him there, his face pale, sweat dripping, his eyes darting between her rifle and the flames licking at the walls, and she saw in that moment not a master but a coward, a man who had built his empire on fear because he had none of his own strength, and she raised her weapon, meeting his eyes and said nothing because words were wasted on men like him, and then she pulled the trigger, the blast echoing like thunder as his body crumpled, the Empire's spine shattering with him, and for a heartbeat the bunker was still, the air heavy with smoke and the metallic tang of blood, and then the roar of battle outside surged back into focus, her fighters clashing with the last of the mercenaries, the fortress shaking with the chaos of collapse. But she did not stop, she pressed forward, sweeping the command center, ensuring no one else remained, then dragging the leader's body out into the open where the rebels could see, and when she hurled it down the steps of the bunker, silence spread across the battlefield, the mercenaries faltering mid-fight, their eyes widening as the image of their fallen commander seared itself into their minds, and in that silence she raised her rifle high, her voice carrying like a blade cutting through the smoke, declaring that the empire was finished, that its master was dead, and that those who surrendered would live while those who resisted would be buried beneath the ruins, and the effect was instant. The mercenaries who had fought with arrogance now threw down their weapons, hands raised, fear replacing defiance, their discipline crumbling without the spine that had held them upright, and the rebels surged forward, not to slaughter but to seize, binding prisoners, securing the armories, tearing down the flags of the empire and raising their own crude banners fashioned from cloth and blood, and the fortress that had once been a symbol of domination became a monument to rebellion, its walls cracked, its gates broken, its throne empty, and as the fires burned, as the prisoners still caged within its depths were freed and stumbled into the light, their faces breaking into sobs and laughter, she stood at the center of it all, her rifle still heavy in her hands, her body bruised and bloodied but unbowed, and for the first time since the chains had been locked on her wrists, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the weight of victory pressing down on her chest, not as relief but as reality, because she knew victory was never pure, that it carried with it the ghosts of the fallen, the faces of those who had bled and would never rise again, but she also knew their sacrifice had not been in vain, that every drop of blood spilled had carved the path to this moment, and she would carry their memory not as chains but as armor. And when dawn broke, painting the fortress in gold and fire, she climbed to the highest tower, her fighters gathering below, villagers and freed prisoners alike, their faces turned upward, and she spoke to them, her voice hoarse but steady, telling them the war was not yet over, that the empire stretched beyond this jungle, that other fortresses still stood, other prisoners still suffered, and they must choose whether to fade back into the shadows or carry the fire forward, to turn this victory into a spark that would ignite a world too long shackled by fear. And as her words carried across the clearing, as silence deepened, the answer rose not in words but in voices, a roar of defiance, of unity, of promise, that they would follow, that they would fight, that they would carry the ghost of chains turned rebel into the heart of every fortress that still stood, and she looked at them, at this army born from starvation and cages, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in so long, hope, not for herself alone but for all of them, for a world where no one would ever again believe she was helpless, because helpless was a lie, a mask forced upon the broken, and she had torn that mask away with blood and fire, and as the sun climbed higher, burning away the smoke, she raised her rifle once more, not as a weapon but as a banner, and the rebellion roared back at her, their voices echoing through the jungle, carried by the wind, carried by the rivers, carried by the world beyond, and in that moment she understood that the story would not end here, that though she had hijacked their chopper, burned their camps, stormed their fortress, this was not an ending but a beginning, the first chapter in a war that would spread like wildfire, and she would lead it, not as a ghost, not as a prisoner, but as the storm they could never cage, the storm that would tear their empires down piece by piece until the world remembered forever that they had once believed she was helpless, and they had been wrong. The end.